The monuments of ancient Egypt, 4,500 years old. Pyramids, tombs, sunken cities, temples. How were they built, and what is yet to be discovered? To build these monuments, millions of blocks of stone were shipped over incredible distances. The materials for the tools came from faraway lands. These feats of logistics still puzzle scientists.
It's a miracle of how the Egyptian constructed this pyramid.
Using only men, tools and boats, without any modern technology, how did the pharaohs build such perfect monuments?
La pyramide d'Hawara est une merveille d'ingénierie. En fait, c'est une pyramide inviolable.
Some of the answers may lie with the river that has been synonymous with Egypt since the Stone Age, the Nile. After the Amazon, the Nile is the longest river in the world, flowing 6,700 kilometers through a dozen countries.
We think of the Nile as unchanging, but in fact, this river has evolved a huge amount over Egypt's history and even before that.
From the first dynasties on, the pharaohs came up with a brilliant idea. Use the Nile as a highway, with dozens of canals branching out, punctuated by large ports.
One of the greatest achievements in ancient Egypt was the management of the Nile and other water systems.
Just what were these navigable waterways and ports used for? How did the Egyptians use the Nile's flood to sail to the pyramids? Why is a pyramid of the Fayum now completely flooded?
In the Old Kingdom, the flood was 80 to 90 billion cubic meters of water.
For the first time, cutting-edge technologies such as photogrammetry, space archaeology and LiDar will be used to find the traces left by the pharaohs along the Nile when building the marvels of ancient Egypt. Between the Giza Plateau, Sakara, and the Fayum Oasis, an excavation area about 25 times the size of Paris, our experts will reveal the debt that the pharaohs owed to the Nile. For without the sacred river and the genius of the Egyptians who transformed it, nothing would have been possible. On the banks of the Nile, in the megalopolis of Cairo and its 20 million people, you could almost forget the ancient remains of the Giza Plateau. A plateau where Cheops, Khafra and Menkore, the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, built the symbols of ancient Egypt. Few tourists venture beyond them. Yet 2 hours by road from Cairo and the former capital of Memphis is an anomaly in the middle of the western desert, the Fayum. An ancient oasis of about 1,500 square kilometers, larger than today's Los Angeles. Its archaeological riddles are yet to be solved. 8 centuries after Cheops's extensive construction projects at Giza, the greatest ruler of the 12th dynasty dedicated his reign to transforming the Fayum. He was Amenemhat III.
Amenemhat III was one of the most important kings of Egypt, and he was important not only because he was a king for a very long time, more than 40 years, but also because he was investing into the country of Egypt on a big scale.
By digging the Bar Youssef Canal in a dried-up offshoot of the Nile, Amenemhat brought the sacred river to the desert, transforming the region into Egypt's oldest man-made agricultural plain. The colossal task created an oasis, and the Nile flowed into the huge saltwater Lake Moeris, also known as Lake Karun.
What Amenemhat III actually did was that he was reopening a connection between the Nile and the Fayum to let water pass more easily from the Nile into this lake.
The lake still exists today. Its billion cubic meters of water cover more than 230 square kilometers.
They took a salty lake and turned it to a freshwater lake by bringing water from the Nile. They really are impressive, not just for their engineering in pyramid building and temple building, but also in hydrology, in water management.
Amenemhat did not content himself with his work on the Nile. To leave his mark in the heart of Egypt, he built two colossi of quartzite between the Nile and the lake, on the banks of a canal that is now dry. Today nothing is left of the colossi but a few stones scattered in the fields around the village of Biamu. But 20 centuries ago, the colossi marked the entrance to the pharaoh's amazing pyramid, which is now completely flooded.
Amenemhat III created at the entrance to this part of the Fayum district a great monument of two colossal statues sitting atop limestone pedestals. Even though today we can't see them sitting on the pedestals, we can imagine their height and their majesty at this really amazing time for Egyptian art.
Ces deux statues qui s'élevaient face au lac représentaient Amenemhat III. Ce sont sans doute les colosses connus les plus anciens.
Only a drone, flying at over 300 meters, can capture the immensity of the site.
On voit très bien les vestiges des deux enceintes. Donc ces enceintes étaient composées de murs en fait épais de près de 5 mètres. Les socles quant à eux sont toujours plus ou moins bien préservés. Et donc sur ces socles étaient posées des statues du pharaon qui mesuraient au moins 11 mètres.
Resting on their 6-meter pedestals, the statues were almost as tall as the Concorde obelisk in Paris. They must have weighed 350 tons each, equivalent to 15 buses. They are the earliest known statues to reach such a height. Set between the Nile and the lake, they marked the entrance to the Fayum and honoured the mighty pharaoh. Today, grass grows in the ruins of the colossi, and the site is hardly ever visited. And yet, it is the gateway to a pyramid built by Amenemhat III, and now completely flooded. "20 kilometers south of the Fayum Colossi is a strange pile of bricks that once stood gleaming very close to the Nile. The Pyramid of Hawara. It is a fascinating pyramid. Amenemhat III intended it to be the most perfect, most secure monument in ancient Egypt. It was the height of a 20-story building, less than half the size of the Great Pyramid. But in its design, it was more than equal to the monuments of the Old Kingdom.
La pyramide d'Hawara est une merveille d'ingénierie. Et cette pyramide est la toute première en fait, à avoir comporté un système de condamnation du tombeau très élaboré.
The pharaoh so wanted it to be perfect that he built a prototype at Dashur, close to the Giza Plateau and the capital, Memphis. That version was unsuccessful.
One of the most fascinating pyramids in the Fayum is that of Amenemhat III. And this king actually had started one pyramid at Dashur, which seems to, due to the site, have subsided and collapsed a bit. So he wasn't very nice, he just put his wife in there.
It wasn't built on solid bedrock, so there were cracks, fissures, and subsiding that developed that meant that they had to abandon the pyramid close to its completion. And instead, what happens is Amenemhat III goes to a new site, Hawara, a place that was associated with the crocodile god, Sobek, and which very much related to water.
Eventually, the pharaoh built his impregnable tomb in the Fayum, between the Nile and Lake Karun, in 1840 BC. A choice not without consequences.
It's a miracle of how the Egyptian constructed this pyramid. It's something amazing because they did learn how to make it, how to try to save it, that the thieves cannot enter inside to steal anything.
C'est une pyramide inviolable. Pour la première fois dans cette pyramide, il n'y a plus de chambre funéraire. Il y a un coffre-fort en fait qui permet vraiment de rendre l'accès à la momie du pharaon et à son viatique impossible.
Everything was designed to ensure that nothing could get inside the pyramid. Nothing except for the waters of the Nile, through a 19th century canal. The interior of the pyramid is impossible to visit, for even though the Nile is now a few kilometres away, it has flooded the tomb and the passageways. The Haara Pyramid is full of water.
This pyramid is flooded with water for one main reason, which is that there's a canal cutting through the site just on this side of the pyramid, and the groundwater leaches through from the canal and comes up into the pyramid.
In these drone shots, taken from over 200 metres, the proximity of the canal is obvious. When it was dug in the 1820s, it allowed the waters of the Nile to penetrate the ancient monument. As a result, nobody has been able to go inside since Flinders Petrie in 1888. And there are no photographs or other images of the interior. So, how can we know what its supposedly exceptional interior is like? Could we dive inside it to explore the access shaft? Egyptologist Zahi Hawass has agreed to explain to us what is already known about the construction of the pyramid.
The whole pyramid is built from mud brick, and it was cased with white, fine limestone. Then you can imagine how this pyramid looked like when it was finished in Dynasty 12 by the shining of the limestone that was cased the whole pyramid.
When completed, Amenemhat III's pyramid was 58 metres high. It used about 200,000 stone blocks, most of them shipped along the Nile, and probably brought to the construction site via an ancient canal. But the heart of the building hides a unique treasure, its burial chamber.
What happened on the construction of the burial chamber, in my opinion, it's more impressive than building Khufu Pyramid.
The burial chamber of the pyramid of Hawara is probably the best constructed of any pyramid, because the burial chamber actually has not just one roof, but it has then 3 roofs.
The chamber is indeed exceptional. It is a huge vault, 7 metres long and almost 2 metres high, carved out of a 100-ton block of quartzite. Above it are 3 additional impassable vaults, the last one a herringbone vault that supports the weight of the building. The quartzite was shipped from quarries north of today's Cairo on barges that could carry such weights over 100 kilometres. All this to build this strongbox, a marvel of design and ingenuity, right down to the chamber housing the pharaoh's mummy. Amenemhat III had indeed designed ancient Egypt's most secure pyramid.
Une dalle avait été laissée surélevée pour qu'on puisse introduire le corps du pharaon et son viatique, puis ensuite abaissée par un système très élaboré, quasiment par un système de vérin, on peut dire ça, qui, une fois fermé, ne pouvait plus donner d'accès possible.
When Flinders Petrie entered the pyramid in the 19th century, there were already a few centimetres of water in the passageways, but he was able to explore them all. Over about 100 meters, the path to the tomb was complex and full of dead ends. But a surprise awaited in the burial chamber. The tomb was empty. The mummy was gone.
La momie d'Amenemhat III a été détruite. On a d'ailleurs retrouvé des traces de charbon, c'est-à-dire de bois calciné. Donc des voleurs de l'Antiquité ont dû vider l'ensemble du viatique funéraire et ont décidé de brûler ce qui restait dans le caveau.
How thieves entered inside and they robbed everything, something I don't know.
What was in the tomb? Was Amenemhat III really buried in Hawara? Or did he choose another pyramid for himself and his queens? The mystery remains.
Inside the Hawara Pyramid, we have a sarcophagus of stone for the pharaoh and some remains, although the whole burial chamber was even filled with water. So the preservation was not very good, in fact. But we have very strong reason to think that that was the burial place of Amenemhat III and not the earlier pyramid at Dahshur.
Egyptologists like Stephen Harvey think that the pharaoh was indeed buried here, because perfectly visible clues are scattered all around the monument. Stephen offers to show us some.
We can see actually a huge hieroglyphic inscription in a vertical line here, and we know who it belongs to because it tells us it's the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, and then here's the cartouche or name ring surrounding the pharaoh, Nimat Ra Amenemhat III. So we know here from evidence still on site that this is the pyramid temple of that pharaoh.
Some pieces scattered around the pyramid have helped researchers identify the materials used to build the burial chamber. Some of the granite blocks even came from southern Egypt. That means they were transported 700 kilometers down the Nile.
We can see here fragments of granite from Aswan, as well as some of the quartzite, which was used for the elaborate burial chamber.
Flinders Petrie drew plans of the pyramid in 1888. Since then, no one has ventured inside. There are no photographs, no films. How can one tell what its water-damaged corridors conceal? Is the hole carved by the sarcophagus looters still accessible? There is only one way to find out. Dive into the narrow tunnel. A man cannot do it. So we will use a remotely operated vehicle, a miniature robot that can move and film in confined underwater spaces. This has never been tried before. There is no precedent. The ROV that will dive inside the Hawara Pyramid was designed in France, here in Lyon. Théo and Thibault, members of the design team, are doing some modifications.
On va enlever tout ce qui est rotule, tout ce qui dépasse ici. Puis je vais régler les moteurs pour pas qu'ils envoient trop de puissance, pour éviter de lever les sédiments.
The ROV must be as compact as possible, as no one knows the size of the hole left by the pyramid robbers.
Maintenant qu'il est bien épuré, on devrait pouvoir passer le trou ici, qui est taille humaine normalement. On va traverser le premier couloir, l'antichambre, un tout petit couloir, et derrière on va passer en dessous le bloc. Et à cet endroit, on devrait pouvoir apercevoir le trou qui a été creusé par les voleurs quand la pyramide a été pillée. On ne sait pas du tout à quoi il ressemble. Et normalement, on devrait pouvoir le voir et
passer dedans. Il n'y a pas de raison, c'est toi qui le fais.
On va croiser les doigts.
It took the engineers several months to perfect the ROV, the one that will, for the first time, dive into the Nile waters that have engulfed the bowels of the Hawara Pyramid.
Allez, c'est parti.
To build his tomb, Amenemhat III drew inspiration from his predecessors Cheops, Khafra and Menkore, who had built their pyramids on the Giza Plateau 800 years earlier. None of those pyramids was flooded by the Nile. How is this possible when there was a port at the foot of the plateau? For the reason, we must turn to outer space. The French National Centre for Space Studies, in Toulouse.
Donc là, je vais zoomer sur le site de Gizeh.
Luc Lapierre, an expert in space archaeology, explains satellite images of the Giza Plateau.
Là, on a une image spectaculaire parce que finalement, la topographie est très riche d'informations. On voit donc les 3 pyramides de Gizeh, Khéops, Képhren, Mygérinos. Elles sont parfaitement carrées. La topographie le met vraiment en exergue. Elles sont parfaitement orientées nord-sud et entourées de petites pyramides secondaires, comme ici, comme ici. Vous percevez ici le Sphinx.
And the port that supplied building materials via the Nile was right by the Sphinx.
On a zoomé sur la zone où se situe le Sphinx et on se rend compte qu'on est aux limites d'une image 3D spatiale. Pour poursuivre, on va utiliser une image optique où on distingue ici parfaitement bien le Sphinx, le temple de Képhren et la zone ici portuaire qui était utilisée pour amener par bateau les pierres qui ont servi à la construction des pyramides.
The Giza Plateau port was connected to the Nile by canals. Some have disappeared, while others were transformed and still exist today.
Vous voyez ici des canaux d'aujourd'hui, hein, le Nil va être par là, mais il devait y en avoir donc, qui se dirigeaient directement vers ces zones portuaires.
Like Giza, every funeral complex in ancient Egypt had a port to receive the huge quantities of construction materials they required, once they were transported along the Nile. In fact, the first man-made ports in history were built in Egypt.
There are a number of ports along the Nile. We've got the ports at Giza. There were ports at Memphis. There were ports at Saqqarah. There were ports at Abu Sir. This is where boats would put in, pick up materials, move them.
Most ports in ancient Egypt were river ports, located on the Nile or its canals, rather than on the sea. The reason is simple. The pharaohs had made the Nile the country's principal road.
Le Nil est essentiel parce qu'en Égypte ancienne, il n'y avait pas de route. C'est pour ça qu'il y avait un réseau de canaux très important, comme un réseau routier.
There would be no Egypt without the Nile River flowing through from the south down to the Mediterranean where it opens up in the delta. And for this reason, temples, pyramids, tombs are distributed throughout.
The ancient Egyptian, before they die and they go in front of Osiris for the judgment, everyone has to swear, I never did anything bad against the Nile.
The canal at Hawara is unusual. It was built after the pyramid, not before. It drains the waters of the Nile to the foot of the monument, flooding the passageways by capillary action. By contrast, the canals around Giza mostly dried up and therefore protected the pyramids from water seepage. For the course of the Nile changed over the millennia, moving further away from the pharaoh's monuments.
The Nile, where it is now, is not where it was in the Old Kingdom. The Nile in the Old Kingdom was way out there, almost to the desert. It was less than a kilometer away from the pyramids.
Le Nil, entre il y a 5000 ans et maintenant, a bougé de 8 km.
The Nile ports used in the construction of the ancient Egyptian monuments have all disappeared. Their remains lie hidden under meters of sediment. For until the 19th century, the Nile had a substantial flood every summer. For the pharaohs, the annual flood was an age-old mystery.
Normally, the flood in the old days started in June. The water rose into September, even a little higher in October, and then it went down. And that flood was huge.
The water could rise up to 10 meters and flood the entire Nile Valley. But the floods also helped Egypt prosper by depositing a rich silt that fertilized the soil for kilometers around.
In the Old Kingdom, the flood was 80 to 90 billion cubic meters of water every year coming onto the land. That's a tremendous amount of water.
The floods could damage the ancient monuments, but they could also help protect them.
Every time the Nile flooded, there was a fresh deposit which stopped erosion from coming and attacking the northern edge of Egypt. And this also played a great role in keeping the land clean because it would wash out salts, which now are in the soil and which wind up destroying archaeological sites and buildings.
The pharaohs learned to take advantage of the seasonality of the Nile. By flooding the land, the river filled up remote canals and ports, which means they were only accessible in summer and autumn, as was the case at Giza.
A lot of the sites where we have found ports unexpectedly, because now they seem to be in the middle of the desert, actually were connected to the Nile. Some of them by canals and some of them because the floods would reach that particular spot. So many of the large monuments, like major temples and the pyramids, for example, you have some canals connecting the Nile with the sort of base of the plateau.
What caused the floods? The pharaohs could only attribute them to the gods, but they came from the sources of the Nile in Central and West Africa. During the monsoon, the sources overflowed, significantly increasing the flow of the river. Since the 19th century, man has done his best to tame the sacred river. The construction of canals and dams in the south of Egypt put an end to the floods.
For modern people, it's very hard to understand the Nile and its extreme significance because, of course, now the Nile has been dammed. There are 2 dams up south of Aswan.
Richard Redding has been conducting research in Egypt since the early 1980s.
Giza is that way.
Richard and his assistant Sayed help us understand the power of the Nile floods.
I think I see bottom there. That's good.
They're taking samples from the bottom of the Nile.
This is the mud at the bottom that we're really interested in. And that's really nice silty clay Nile silt. This would be similar to what the floods would have carried in Pharaonic Egypt. This nice heavy silt, clay, a little bit of sand in it.
During floods, the very high flow of the Nile would carry and deposit this thick mud throughout the valley.
Particularly when the flood was high, it had a lot of energy, it could carry more sand. This is what would have been deposited all over the fields during the flood.
It is estimated that at the time of the pharaohs, the Nile carried more than 110 million tons of sediment a year to the delta. That's 10 times more than today. Richard offers to perform an experiment to recreate the ancient Nile's flood in a bottle.
This represents the Nile, carrying this tremendous silt load in it that it had during the flood season. And as long as the water was moving at high rates, it would carry all this silt and clay and silt and gravel, and it would all be suspended in the water because the water has energy and is carrying it. But as it slows down, as it moves away from the flood moves over the top of the levees, or as it would enter slower areas like harbors, then the energy in the water would not be as high, and slowly the sediments are starting to drop out.
The black silt found deep in certain areas along the Nile is therefore an indicator of the existence of ports, among them that of Giza.
When we drill down, when we core down through the sediments, we get sand and gravel, and then we'll hit a layer of black silt. And that black silt is always that silt that forms at the bottom of harbors. It's very dark, it's very black, and it's mostly clay and silt.
Back in Lyon, in southeastern France. This is where we found the best way to explore the Haara Pyramid, flooded by a canal of the Nile. We will depend on new technology, namely a compact and maneuverable underwater drone, specially designed for the task. Thibault, a mechanical engineer and experienced pilot, accompanies us on the 2.5-hour trip from Cairo to the Fayum. No one in the last 100 years has been able to explore the interior of the pyramid, and there are no pictures of it. Filming a successful dive from the access shaft to the first slab would be a historic step forward.
L'objectif, c'est de descendre au niveau de la descendrie où il y a plein de gravats. On va mettre le drone à l'eau à cet endroit-là, traverser l'antichambre et arriver face à un bloc qui a été percé par les voleurs à l'époque.
The canal dug in the early 19th century to draw water off the Nile has permanently flooded the pyramid. Our mission is to explore the first passageway, assess the condition of the walls, and confirm that the hole carved by the robbers is not obstructed. But the task will be tricky. The sediment is thick, and the smallest mistake might turn the clear water into a dark, impassable pool.
Ça va être difficile parce que, étant donné l'état des galeries, il y a énormément de sédiments déposés sur le fond. S'il y a un flux d'un moteur qui vient perturber les sédiments, ça fait des nuages qui viennent devant la caméra et les lampes, et on devient aveugle.
The pyramid entrance is narrow, but Thibault manages to launch the drone. Now is the moment of truth. The motors are switched on, and the robot starts its dive deep inside the pyramid. But Thibault's work has just begun. Using a joystick, he must constantly adjust the speed, depth, and angle of the drone by monitoring the images the camera is sending to his laptop. We must go slowly. The descent takes several long minutes.
On a 4 mètres de profondeur. Là, on doit être en train de passer l'antichambre parce que j'ai plus le plafond qui me gêne. Du moins pour l'instant. Et là, on est à 5 mètres de profondeur. Il y a tout le câble qui se déroule. Et on devrait bientôt arriver sous la herse qui a été percée par des voleurs et sûrement empruntée par l'archéologue Petrie en 1888 quand il est rentré dans la pyramide. Là, j'avance vraiment bien. Il est vraiment rectiligne, quoi. Bon, le câble se fait avaler.
We're more than 10 meters in. In front of us appears what looks like a huge heap of rubble.
Je pense que je suis déjà sous la herse et que là, je suis au niveau du trou de voleur, là. Donc là, je dois changer l'inclinaison du drone pour essayer de retrouver de la lumière.
According to Petrie's plans, the hole carved by the pyramid robbers should be here. But over the years, it could have been blocked. There is only one way to find out. Send the drone into that black underwater hole, at the risk of losing it.
Qu'est-ce qui se passe? Je pense avoir passé le trou, là. On a du câble. Je sais pas encore. Et là, j'arrive à avancer. C'est étrange. Là, j'ai des sédiments. Faut que j'essaye de remonter. Je suis à 4 mètres de profondeur.
We can't see anything. All seems lost, when suddenly...
Oh! C'est bon, je suis de l'autre côté. Je suis de l'autre côté. J'ai une image. On est remonté à 3 mètres de profondeur, or c'est impossible si on n'a pas passé le trou. Donc on a passé le trou. Donc là, si j'avance... Ah. Il y avait des blocs. Je suis à 2 mètres de profondeur.
For the first time since Petrie, we have just explored the access shaft of the Hawara Pyramid, flooded by the Nile. Our exclusive footage will allow Egyptologists to assess the state of the first passageway and slab. We now know that the hole made by the robbers is still accessible.
Dès que j'ai réussi à passer le trou, J'étais comme aspiré en réalité et je suis passé de 5 mètres à 2-3 mètres. Ça faisait comme des nuages et j'ai pu apercevoir pendant quelques secondes un endroit clair. Et donc je ne sais pas encore ce que c'est, on va analyser ça après.
A few weeks later, we show our images to Franck Monnier, an expert in ancient Egyptian construction. He is the first specialist to see them.
Ce qu'on remarque avec cette vidéo, c'est que l'état de la pyramide est très bon. On aurait pu s'attendre à ce que l'eau endommage vraiment les structures. On remarque vraiment que les plafonds, les murs sont en bon état. Alors, juste à la fin de ce petit parcours, on remarque aussi la présence de gros blocs de pierre. Donc la question, c'est de savoir si ces blocs sont des blocs qui obstruent le passage horizontal, le couloir dit aveugle, ou bien s'ils obstruent la suite de la distribution. Ça, c'est une question qu'il faudra résoudre par la suite.
The slab for closing the passageway is in the open position. Franck notices a very interesting detail at its base.
Elle est en quartzite. Elle n'est pas en calcaire, cette verse. C'est pour ça qu'on veut une couleur quand même différente. En fait, elle pénètre dans le mur en face. Elle repose ici. Et on voit qu'elle est inclinée. Sur les rapports de Petrie, elle n'est pas inclinée. Il les a représentées à l'horizontale. Donc déjà ça, on peut corriger aussi.
The flooded Hawara Pyramid has yielded up new secrets. It is in surprisingly good condition. The plans will now be revised and enriched by the first pictures of the interior. But it will take years to explore all the passages leading to the burial chamber. How long will it last, being eaten away by the Nile? Its days seem numbered.
I tried, as the head of antiquities, to save this pyramid. I couldn't, because the only way to save this pyramid is to treat the major problem of the agricultural land and the canal. To do that, it's a big project. It's not in my hand as an archaeologist.
Despite the menace of the canal, the Hawara Pyramid is still standing, more than 3,500 years after its construction. And so are the pyramids of Giza and Sakara. By studying the ports and canals of these ancient monuments, Egyptologists seek to better understand the construction methods and the raw material supply that ensured their longevity. That is how French archaeologists recently made an important discovery: a satellite port that enabled the pharaohs to connect the banks of the Nile to the shores of the Red Sea, and so to send out expeditions to obtain an essential material, copper.
We think about ancient Egypt, we think about these pyramids, we think about monumental constructions like temples, cities, tombs, but in fact, one of the greatest achievements in ancient Egypt was the management of the Nile and other water systems, canals, irrigation basins, and waterways that would provide access to the Red Sea.
From the Giza Plateau, we leave the Nile to go to the Red Sea, south of the coastal city of Zafarana in Wadi al-Jaf, 200 kilometers through the desert. This is where this satellite port can be found, 160 kilometers from the Nile. It is attributed to Pharaoh Cheops. But what were his expeditions like?
On sait que le cuivre, qui était un matériau très important pour la fabrication des outils, provenait du Sinaï.
From the time of the Old Kingdom, Egyptians travelled from Cheops's port in Wadi al-Jaf to the Sinai to obtain the copper needed to manufacture tools. They returned via the port on the Nile. The boats were built in the Nile Valley, then dismantled, transported overland, and reassembled by the Red Sea. The two ports were 200 kilometres apart. That journey was done on foot. By flying a drone at 300 metres, we can see vestiges of Cheops's port, the oldest man-made seaport in the world. From the sky, its L-shaped quay appears at the top of the image, and the far end still reaches the shore. Today we follow a team of divers from the Central Department of Underwater Antiquities in their excavations on the Red Sea, where the port was discovered.
So we are going to check the breakwaters. This consists of two breakwaters, one 600 meter, and then the other one irregular for 120 meters. Also, we are going to check the anchor site, and if you can find something, you can draw it, register everything, just to have a final map of all the sites. Okay, and I need a report when you finish. Each one has to give me a report about everything with details, and good luck.
This time our underwater drone will film their dive. It is piloted by Cédric and Jean-Baptiste.
Ok, au niveau du câble, on est bon.
As they are not allowed to bring any remains ashore, Ehab's team will rely on the images from the drone's camera to study any items they discover. Jean-Baptiste must control the length and angle of the cable, which is the only means of communication with the drone. Cédric keeps an eye on the monitor so he doesn't lose sight of the divers. The current is strong, and one moment of inattention could jeopardize the expedition. A few minutes into the dive, Ehab informs us that they have spotted the archaeological site. The drone's camera films the site, which has been buried in the sand for the last 4,600 years.
We dove there on the anchors area. We saw the big one, then we filmed it and we drew some of them.
This is a unique site. It has about 20 limestone boat anchors, with attachment holes 12 to 18 centimeters in diameter. The variation in anchor sizes suggests the range of boats that must have anchored here.
The small one, most of them are covered with sand. So because of the weather, sand is moving down. So with any movement you can't see. The visibility is not so good, actually. It's 1 meter.
Thanks to these ongoing excavations, we now know that the pharaohs not only turned the Nile into ancient Egypt's vital traffic artery, but also made it a significant connecting bridge to other countries, from which boats sailed to supply materials for the immense projects of the Old Kingdom.
I really believe that the discovery of Wadi al-Jarf is the most important discovery ever happened in history until today.
This oldest seaport in the world makes it easier to understand the connection between the Nile, the Red Sea, and the entire country, more than 4,600 years ago. The pharaohs never stopped building ports, but one of the best preserved ports on the Nile is, surprisingly, the least noticed. South of Cairo is ancient Egypt's largest burial ground, Sakara. It was the main necropolis of Memphis, for centuries the capital of the pharaohs.
One of the most sacred sites in Egypt is the site of Saqqarah, which is known nowadays for the Pyramid of Zoser, which is really the first great stone monument ever to be built in the world.
Saqqarah's necropolis was in use from the First Dynasty to the advent of Christianity. But to guarantee its development, it had to be connected to the Nile. Around 2400 BC, the port built by Pharaoh Unas ensured the prosperity of the necropolis. The Nile canals that supplied the port are now hidden by fields and vegetation. But we will try an unprecedented experiment to prove the existence of ancient canals with technology never before used in Egypt. At the entrance to the Saqqarah site, we meet Egyptologist Vasil Dobrev. He knows Saqqarah particularly well.
Derrière moi, c'est le temple d'Ounas. On est vers 2400 avant notre ère. Ounas, c'est le dernier roi de la 5e dynastie. C'est ici qu'on va le momifier. Et donc, ici, cette rampe montre bien qu'on est dans l'eau. Et puis, c'est un port qui est nourri par l'eau qui vient du Nil, par des canaux.
In the time of Unas, standing right where he is now, Vasil would have been wholly underwater. The Nile was less than 1 kilometre from the port. Today, the river has retreated 7 kilometres.
Avec la crue du Nil, l'eau arrivait massivement. Donc il fallait absolument qu'ils creusent des canaux pour guider cette eau. Et c'était là la voie de communication à l'époque, il n'y avait pas de route.
The remains of Unas's port hint at the size of the whole installation. An artificial basin, covering more than 2 hectares and at least 2 metres deep, received the boats loaded with stone. In the middle, a quay divided the basin in two.
C'était certainement un port énorme. Donc ici, on voit un mur, certainement une espèce de rampe là, qui descendait, qui rejoignait le canal, parce que le canal arrive à un moment donné et puis après, on monte.
Archaeologists are trying to find vestiges of the ancient canals connecting the Nile to this fascinating port. But there's a problem. This vast area is planted with palm trees that hide the anomalies in the ground. Could ancient canals still be visible under this vegetation? How did the boats sail from the Nile to the port? We have offered Vasil the use for the first time in Egypt of a revolutionary technology. LiDar. It is a laser beam able to map the ground from the sky through vegetation.
If we can have 100 meter spacing between each line.
Julien Bernard is a French LiDAR drone expert. The model he has developed is unique. At an altitude of 85 meters, this 3-kilogram device scans with an accuracy of 2 to 3 centimeters.
Le principe du LiDAR, c'est qu'on a un scanner qui va envoyer un laser qui va être réfléchi sur des obstacles. Donc il peut être réfléchi à plusieurs niveaux. Et ensuite, ça va être récupéré par le scanner. Et en fonction du temps de voyage du laser, on va en déduire la distance.
Our schedule is tight. We will fly over 2 zones, 90 hectares in all, between Saqqarah and Helwan, close to the Nile. LiDAR can scan 10 hectares per 10-minute flight and offers more possibilities than photogrammetry. Supervised by Vasil, the team prepares the flight plan. We have only one day to make sure this unique experiment succeeds.
Mais il faut aller plus par là, hein, pour attraper le temple. Encore, derrière. Parce qu'on n'a pas le mur. Hein. C'est ça.
On va se mettre là.
Voilà.
Okay.
No problem. Let's go.
Great.
Ashur. Adawar. Adawar.
Vasil witnesses the launch of this historic flight. His great hope is to find traces of ancient Nile canals.
Je suis très ému là, parce que c'est vraiment un rêve d'enfant qui se produit là. Un rêve d'archéologue d'avoir un plan avec le LiDAR en direct là. C'est génial.
Immediately after the scan, Julien can visualize the data.
Je vérifie qu'on a bien suffisamment de points au sol. On voit qu'avec les palmiers, voilà, on a suffisamment de lasers qui atteignent jusque le sol. Et on a une telle densité que si on zoome arrière, on a l'impression que c'est continu, mais c'est vraiment des millions et des millions de points individuels.
After a few hours of processing, the result is spectacular. The ground scanned by LiDAR appears clearly. In one click, it is possible to take measurements and above all to remove the laser-scanned vegetation to see what lies underneath. Olivier Onésime, our topographer, has agreed to analyse these exclusive images. He at once spots a fascinating detail, invisible to the naked eye on the ground.
Quand j'ai vu pour la première fois ces images, il y a un alignement qui apparaît. Alors, qui est absolument pas visible à l'œil nu ni dans le paysage quand on se promène, parce que je connais bien la zone. Quand j'enlève la végétation, on voit très bien l'alignement. Et si on le prolonge, on est quasiment dans l'alignement de la jetée d'Unas.
Using digital tools on the image, we check the alignment and orientation of each element. Unas's port is on the top left of the image, and the Nile on the right. This is an exceptional discovery. This image may have revealed an ancient canal that allowed boats to reach the necropolis of Saqqarah from the Nile more than 4,000 years ago.
Est-ce que ça pourrait être un ancien canal? Est-ce qu'au contraire, ça peut être une jetée qui donnerait accès directement au port d'Unas à sec en période de crue? Ça ouvre des perspectives absolument fantastiques.
Thanks to these surveys, archaeologists will be able to carry out new excavations in coming years and perhaps discover new remains left by the pharaohs along the Nile. From the ports of Giza and Sakara to the fascinating port constructions of the Red Sea, the pharaohs left many clues linked to the sacred river. Thanks to new technologies in the service of archaeology, we can now uncover the lost access routes that were vital to the construction of the pyramids and explore sites thought to have disappeared forever, such as the Haara Pyramid, a unique structure flooded by the Nile, whose doors may have opened for the first time in more than a century.